My name is Thunder, and I've roamed these Colorado mountains for 12 years. I've seen drought turn green valleys into tinderboxes, watched lightning split ancient pines, and felt the earth tremble under nature's wrath. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what happened on that October night when two storms collided, one in the sky, one on the ground. The wind had been building all day, carrying scents that made my nostrils flare with unease. Not the clean smell of rain, but something acrid, dangerous. My herd was restless, pawing at the rocky ground of our sheltered canyon, but I couldn't shake the feeling that staying put would be our death sentence. As darkness fell, the first lightning bolt illuminated the ridge above us like a photographer's flash, revealing something that made my blood run cold. Orange flames were dancing through the pine forest, growing stronger with each gust of wind. The wildfire had found us. But this wasn't just any fire. This was a monster. I watched in horror as 100-year-old trees became torches in seconds, their branches reaching toward the storm clouds like desperate fingers. The sound was terrifying, a combination of crackling wood, howling wind, and something else, something that sounded almost like screaming. My instincts screamed at me to run, to lead my family away from this inferno. We could escape deeper into the wilderness, find safety in the remote valleys where humans never ventured. It would be the smart choice, the survival choice. But as I turned to gather my herd, a new scent hit me on the wind, one that changed everything. Smoke. Not just wood smoke, but the distinct smell of burning structures. Somewhere beyond these mountains, the fire had already jumped the containment lines. It was heading toward the valley, toward the small town of Pine Ridge where families were probably sleeping peacefully, unaware that death was racing toward them through the storm. I knew that valley well. During harsh winters, when food was scarce in the high country, I'd led my herd down to the edges of human territory. I'd seen children playing in backyards, watched fathers teaching sons to fish in the creek, observed mothers hanging laundry while singing softly to themselves. These weren't the humans who'd tried to capture us or fence us in, these were just people living their lives. The wind shifted again, and I could smell it more clearly now. Burning houses, melting plastic, and worse. The fire wasn't just threatening the wilderness anymore. It was about to consume an entire community. Lightning crashed again, closer this time, and in that brilliant moment I saw the full scope of the disaster. The fire had already crossed Highway 40. It was moving faster than any wildfire I'd ever witnessed, fed by the storm winds and decades of drought-dried vegetation. At this rate, it would reach Pine Ridge before dawn. That's when I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of leading my herd to safety, I reared up on my hind legs and let out a call that cut through the storm like a blade. It was a sound I'd never made before, part warning, part goodbye, part prayer. My family looked at me with confusion in their eyes, but I had no time to explain. I turned away from safety, away from survival, away from everything my instincts demanded, and I began to run. Not away from the fire, but toward it. Toward the danger. Toward the humans who had no idea what was coming for them. 8 kilometers. That's the distance between life and death, between a sleeping town and an approaching inferno. 8 kilometers of treacherous mountain terrain that I'd have to cover in a storm that was trying to kill me with every step. The moment I left my herd behind, the full fury of the weather hit me like a physical blow. Rain lashed my face with the force of tiny bullets, each drop stinging as it struck. The wind was so strong it threatened to knock me sideways with every gust, howling through the canyon like some prehistoric beast. But the storm was nothing compared to what was behind me. I could feel the heat of the fire on my back, even through the rain. It was following me, chasing me, and growing stronger with each passing minute. The contradiction was almost unbearable, running through a deluge while being pursued by flames. My hooves slipped on the wet rocks as I descended the first ridge. This wasn't the careful, measured pace of a wild horse moving through familiar territory. This was desperation given form, every muscle in my body screaming as I pushed myself beyond my limits. I'd never run this hard, this fast, this recklessly. The first mile nearly killed me. I misjudged a jump over a fallen log and crashed into a thicket of thorns that tore at my hide like claws. Blood mixed with rainwater as it streamed down my flanks, but I couldn't stop. Behind me, the orange glow was growing brighter, and I could hear the fire's voice now, a deep, rumbling roar that seemed to come from the earth itself. As I reached the main trail that led toward the valley, a new challenge presented itself. The storm had turned the normally manageable creek crossings into raging torrents. The first one stopped me cold. What had been a gentle stream that morning was now a muddy river 20 feet across, filled with debris and moving with deadly force. I paced along the bank, precious seconds ticking away as I searched for a crossing point. The fire's glow was reflecting off the storm clouds now, turning the entire sky an ominous orange. I could smell burning animals, creatures that hadn't been as lucky as my herd, who hadn't had someone willing to risk everything for strangers. Finally, I found a spot where a massive pine had fallen across the water. Its trunk was slick with rain and moss, but it was my only chance. I climbed onto the makeshift bridge, my hooves sliding with each step. Halfway across, a piece of debris slammed into the log, shaking it so violently I nearly fell into the torrent below. But I made it. Somehow, impossibly, I made it. The second mile was worse. The trail here was steep and rocky, made treacherous by the storm. I fell twice, scraping skin from my knees and chest, but each time I forced myself back up. I had to keep moving. Every second counted now. It was during the third mile that I began to understand what I was really doing. This wasn't just about warning the humans in Pine Ridge. It was about proving something, to myself, to my herd, to every wild creature that had ever been dismissed as just an animal. We understood more than humans realized. We felt more than they gave us credit for. And sometimes, we were capable of more courage than they could imagine. The rain was getting worse, if that was possible. It came down in sheets now, turning the world into a gray blur. I could barely see 10 feet ahead, navigating more by instinct and memory than sight. But I knew these mountains better than any GPS system. Every rock, every tree, every twist in the trail was burned into my memory from years of roaming free. Mile 4 brought me to the old mining road, and that's when I saw them. Headlights in the distance, barely visible through the storm. A vehicle was coming up the mountain, probably some late-night traveler, or maybe someone who worked the night shift in the valley below. I could have stopped them, could have tried to communicate the danger somehow. But how do you tell a human that death is chasing you through the mountains? How do you make them understand that their peaceful little town is about to become hell on earth? Instead, I kept running, knowing that my destination held the only people who might understand, who might be able to act on what I was about to tell them. The fire station in Pine Ridge was still 4 miles away, but it represented the town's only hope. As I crested the next hill, the wind brought me a scent that made my heart race even faster. The fire had jumped another ridge. It was moving even faster than I'd feared, feeding on the storm's oxygen-rich winds and the drought-dried forest like some unstoppable force of nature. I was running out of time, and I was running out of strength. But I wasn't running out of determination. Mile 5 nearly broke me. The trail here descended sharply into Devil's Canyon, a treacherous stretch that was dangerous even in good weather. In this storm, it was like navigating the edge of the world while blind. Every step could be my last, every hoofbeat a gamble with gravity and death. The rain had turned the earth into a slippery nightmare. What should have been solid ground was now mud that grabbed at my hooves like quicksand. I fell hard at the canyon's edge, tumbling 20 feet down a rocky slope before catching myself against a boulder. The impact knocked the wind from my lungs, and for a terrifying moment, I couldn't breathe. Lying there in the mud and rain, blood streaming from new cuts across my chest and legs, I almost gave up. Every muscle in my body was screaming in protest. My lungs felt like they were on fire, my heart was beating so hard I thought it might burst, and I was still 3 miles from town. But then the wind shifted, and I caught a new scent that made my blood freeze. It wasn't just wood smoke anymore, it was the smell of burning homes, melting asphalt, and worse. The fire had reached the outskirts of Pine Ridge. I wasn't racing to prevent a disaster anymore, I was racing to minimize one that had already begun. I forced myself back to my hooves and kept running, but now I could see the orange glow reflecting off the storm clouds ahead of me. The entire southern horizon was lit up like a sunset, except it was past midnight. The fire wasn't just approaching Pine Ridge, it was already there. As I crested the hill above the valley, the full scope of the catastrophe hit me. The wildfire had indeed reached the edge of town, but it was moving in a pattern I hadn't expected. Instead of consuming everything in its path, it was being channeled by the valley's geography and the storm winds into several distinct fingers of flame. One finger was racing along the old highway toward the residential area where families slept. Another was following the power lines toward the industrial district. But the most dangerous finger was heading directly for the propane depot on the town's east side, thousands of gallons of compressed gas that would turn the entire valley into an inferno if the flames reached it. The fire station sat directly in the path of that eastern finger. If I was going to warn anyone, I had to get there before the flames did. I had maybe 20 minutes, maybe less. Mile 6 took me through the old cemetery, where generations of Pine Ridge residents lay at rest. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was running through a place of the dead to try to save the living. The wind howled through the ancient oaks and weathered headstones, creating an eerie symphony that seemed to urge me forward. But it was here, among the graves of strangers, that I nearly encountered my own death. A massive oak tree, weakened by years of drought and battered by the storm, chose that moment to fall. I heard the crack, that distinctive sound of wood splitting under stress, and looked up to see hundreds of pounds of tree falling directly toward me. I lunged forward with everything I had left, feeling the branches brush my back as the oak crashed to the ground exactly where I'd been standing a split second earlier. The impact shook the earth like an earthquake, and debris pelted my flanks like shrapnel. Mile 7 brought me to the outskirts of Pine Ridge proper, and what I saw made my heart clench with despair. The fire had moved faster than even my worst fears. Several houses on the south side were already engulfed in flames, their windows glowing like demonic eyes in the storm. Power lines were down, sparking and dancing in the rain like electric snakes. But what terrified me most was the silence. Despite the destruction, despite the approaching inferno, the town was still asleep. Windows were dark, streets were empty, and no alarms were sounding. They had no idea what was happening just a few hundred yards away. I could see the fire station now, 2 blocks ahead. It was a modern building with red brick walls and large bay doors for the trucks. But even from here, I could see the problem. The building was dark. No lights, no activity, no indication that anyone was aware of the crisis bearing down on them. As I ran down Main Street, my hooves clattering on the wet asphalt, I passed a playground where children had played just hours earlier. Swings moved eerily in the wind, and I could imagine the laughter that had filled this space during happier times. Now it was about to become a memory, consumed by flames that were racing through the valley like Judgment Day. The last 100 yards were the hardest. My body was shutting down, my legs moving more from determination than strength. I could barely see through the rain and exhaustion, but the fire station's outline grew larger with each step. That's when I saw him, a single figure visible through the station's windows. One firefighter, working late or maybe unable to sleep through the storm. One person who might be able to turn disaster into salvation if I could just find a way to make him understand. I didn't know how to communicate with humans. I didn't know their language or their customs. But I knew something they didn't. Death was coming for their town, and I was their only warning. The moment I reached the fire station, my legs finally gave out. I collapsed against the large bay doors, my sides heaving like bellows, every breath a struggle against exhaustion and pain. But I wasn't done yet. I couldn't be done. Inside, I could see him clearly now through the windows. A middle-aged man with graying hair and tired eyes, sitting at a desk with paperwork spread in front of him. Captain Jake Morrison, though I didn't know his name then. I could see from his posture that he was fighting sleep, probably pulling a double shift because of the storm. I had to get his attention, but how? I'd never tried to communicate with humans before, never needed to bridge the gap between our worlds. Every instinct told me to avoid contact, to remain hidden, to preserve the secret freedom that defined my existence. But tonight, instinct had to take a back seat to something bigger. I reared up on my hind legs and brought my front hooves down hard against the metal doors. The sound echoed through the station like thunder, sharp and impossible to ignore. Inside, I saw the man's head snap up, his eyes searching for the source of the noise. I did it again, harder this time, and added my voice, a desperate whinny that carried all the urgency I felt. The man stood up, confused, and walked toward the windows. When he saw me standing there in the storm, wild-eyed and bleeding, his jaw dropped. For a moment, we just stared at each other through the glass. I could see him trying to process what he was seeing, a wild horse at his door in the middle of a storm, clearly distressed and obviously trying to communicate something. But then he did something that changed everything. Instead of dismissing me as just another animal seeking shelter from the weather, he opened the door. "Easy there, boy," he said, his voice calm despite his obvious confusion. "What are you doing out in this storm?" I backed away from the door, then moved toward the street, looking back at him. When he didn't follow, I returned and repeated the action. Back toward the street, then back to him. The universal language of "follow me" that transcends species. But he still didn't understand. He was looking at me with concern, probably thinking I was injured or lost. In desperation, I did something that went against every survival instinct I possessed. I moved closer to him, close enough that I could smell his coffee and the rain on his uniform. That's when he noticed the blood. Not just the fresh cuts from my desperate run, but older scars that marked me as a wild horse who'd lived free for years. His expression changed from confusion to amazement. "You're one of the Mustangs from the high country," he whispered. "What the hell are you doing down here?" I backed toward the street again, more urgently this time, and that's when the wind brought the scent that changed everything. Even human noses could detect it now, the acrid smell of smoke, carried on the storm winds from the fires already consuming the south side of town. His head snapped up, nostrils flaring as he caught the scent. "Smoke," he said, and I saw understanding begin to dawn in his eyes. "You're trying to tell me about a fire." I whinnied again, nodding my head up and down in a motion I'd seen humans use for yes. His eyes widened as he realized what was happening. "Jesus Christ," he breathed, and ran back into the station. Within seconds, every light in the building blazed to life. Alarms began blaring, and I could hear him on the radio, his voice urgent and professional. "This is Station 12. We have a wildfire situation developing on the south side of town. I repeat, we have an active wildfire in the residential area." Other voices crackled through the radio, some skeptical, some demanding details. But Captain Morrison had already moved beyond doubt. He was suiting up, his movements quick and efficient. "How did you know about this?" he asked me as he pulled on his gear. "How far has it spread?" I couldn't answer in words, but I could show him. I moved to the large window that faced south and reared up, placing my hooves against the glass. Through the rain and darkness, the orange glow was now visible even to human eyes. "My God," he whispered. "It's already here." The first fire truck roared to life, its diesel engine drowning out the storm for a moment. Other firefighters were arriving now, called in by the emergency alert. They stared at me in amazement as they geared up, but there was no time for questions. Captain Morrison paused at the truck's door and looked back at me. "I don't know how you knew, or why you came here, but you just saved this town." But as I watched them race toward the flames, I realized something that made my blood run cold. In my desperate focus on reaching the fire station, I'd missed something crucial. The fire wasn't just spreading through the residential area, it was moving in multiple directions at once. And one of those directions was back toward the mountains, back toward the canyon where I'd left my herd. The choice I'd made to save human lives might have doomed my own family. The storm winds that had helped the fire spread so quickly through town were now pushing it back into the wilderness, into areas where no fire trucks could follow. I had to choose again, stay and help guide the firefighters through the urban disaster, or race back into the mountains to try to save my herd. Either choice meant abandoning someone to the flames. But as I stood there in the rain, watching the red lights disappear into the storm, I realized there might be a third option, one that would require everything I had left, and probably more. What happened next still seems impossible, even to me. As I stood outside that fire station, torn between two impossible choices, I heard something that changed everything, the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching through the storm. My herd was coming. Through the rain and wind, I could make out their shapes. My mare Luna leading the way, followed by the young stallions Sage and River, and behind them the rest of my family. 23 horses in total, running through the storm not away from danger, but toward it. They'd followed me. Despite every instinct screaming at them to flee to safety, they'd tracked my path through 8 kilometers of treacherous terrain and deadly weather. But why? Luna approached me first, her dark eyes reflecting the fire's glow. She nuzzled my neck, and in that simple gesture, I understood. They hadn't come because they were lost or afraid. They'd come because they'd figured out what I was trying to do, and they'd decided to help. Wild horses are often dismissed as simple animals, driven only by basic needs and fears. But we're capable of something humans rarely credit us with. We can choose to be more than our instincts. We can choose courage over safety, community over self-preservation, and love over survival. My herd had made that choice. What followed was the most extraordinary night of my life. While the human firefighters battled the blazes in town, my herd and I became something unprecedented, a wild search and rescue team, working to save both human and animal lives throughout the valley. We split into groups, each taking a different sector of the endangered area. Luna led a group toward the retirement home on Oak Street, where elderly residents would have trouble evacuating quickly. Sage and River headed for the elementary school, which was being used as an impromptu shelter for families evacuating from the fire's path. I stayed with Captain Morrison's crew, serving as a guide through areas where their trucks couldn't go. My knowledge of every trail, every shortcut, every safe passage through the valley became invaluable as they worked to contain the spreading flames. But the most incredible moment came at dawn, when the storm finally began to break and we could see the full scope of what we'd accomplished. The fire, which should have consumed half the town, had been contained to less than a dozen structures. The propane depot that would have created a massive explosion had been protected by firefighters who reached it in time, guided by paths that only we wild horses knew existed. More importantly, not a single life had been lost, human or animal. As the sun rose through the clearing clouds, painting the smoke-filled sky in shades of gold and orange, Captain Morrison found me standing on the hill overlooking the town. He was exhausted, covered in soot and ash, but alive. "I've been a firefighter for 23 years, he said quietly, and I've never seen anything like what happened tonight. Not just the fire, what you did. What all of you did." He was quiet for a moment, looking out over Pine Ridge. The damage was visible but manageable: scorched earth where houses once stood, blackened trees like skeletal fingers against the sky, but also something else. People helping each other, families reunited, a community that had survived its greatest test. "You know what the strangest part is?" he continued. "This morning, I got a call from the Weather Service. They've been tracking this storm system for days, and according to their models, it should have produced lightning strikes all through the mountains last night. Strikes that would have started dozens of fires simultaneously." I looked at him, not understanding where he was going with this. "But their satellite data shows something impossible. The lightning stopped exactly at midnight, right when you showed up at my station. The storm continued, but the electrical activity just ceased. As if something was protecting the mountains from further fires while we dealt with the one that had already started." He turned to look at me directly, and I saw something in his eyes that I'd never seen from a human before. Not fear, not dominance, but recognition. Respect. "I don't know what you are exactly," he said. "I mean, I know you're a wild horse, but you're something more than that, aren't you? Tonight, you didn't just warn us about a fire. You coordinated a rescue operation that saved hundreds of lives. You demonstrated intelligence, compassion, and courage that put most humans to shame." As if summoned by his words, my herd appeared on the ridge behind us. 23 wild horses silhouetted against the sunrise, no longer just animals seeking survival, but beings who had chosen to risk everything for others. Captain Morrison took off his helmet and ran his hands through his gray hair. "I have to write a report about tonight," he said. "How do I explain that a wild horse saved our town? How do I tell my superiors that we were guided through the night by creatures that aren't supposed to be capable of complex reasoning or selfless action?" I wished I could speak his language, could tell him that we'd always been capable of these things. That intelligence and compassion aren't limited to humans, that the courage to risk everything for others beats in hearts that have never known the safety of walls or the certainty of tomorrow's meal. Instead, I did something simpler. I walked over to him and gently rested my muzzle against his shoulder, a gesture of friendship, of mutual respect between two beings who had faced death together and emerged victorious. He reached up and touched my neck, and in that moment, I realized the most important thing about that night. It wasn't just about a wild horse saving a town from fire. It was about two worlds, human and wild, discovering that they were capable of understanding each other in ways that transcended language, culture, and species. As my herd and I prepared to return to the mountains, Captain Morrison called out one last time, "Will we see you again?" I looked back at him, at the town that was already beginning to rebuild, at the community that had learned they were protected by guardians they never knew existed. Some secrets, I realized, are meant to be shared. Some stories are meant to change how the world sees the wild places and the creatures that call them home. My name is Thunder, and this is the night I learned that being wild doesn't mean being alone, and that sometimes the greatest courage comes from crossing the impossible distance between different worlds to offer the simple gift of help when it's needed most. The sun was fully up now, warming our backs as we began the journey home. But home, I realized, was bigger than I'd ever imagined. It included these mountains, this valley, and the people who now knew that wildness and civilization could work together when the stakes were high enough. And sometimes, just sometimes, that makes all the difference.